Welcome to part 2, titled Sabbath Days Begin When? And in part 1 at the end, I predicted that I would cover Yom Kippur, the evening to evening, because the 10th day, when it begins and when it ends, and that's considered an annual Shabbat. And so when do Sabbaths begin? I was planning on covering that in part 2 until Joshua Schroeder out there, thank you brother, reminded me of Nehemiah, or we say Nehemiah, chapter 13, where this is, wow, it is so much more explicit, not so many homonyms and different ways to interpret it. And let's put the scriptures to the test when it comes to a difficult topic on this, is when we do have homonyms and different ways to interpret scriptures and different definitions because of the homonyms. But this chapter is perhaps the most explicit chapter on this topic, showing when a Sabbath day begins. I'm not talking about calendar days or counting forward 40 days and 40 nights or 3 days and 3 nights, but when a Sabbath begins. And well, I'm going to go to verses 15 through 22 and cover the key verses in these 7 verses and the key Hebrew words, not all the Hebrew words and citation of the text, but key Hebrew words. I don't want to blow the beginners out of the water here and get too above their head and complicated, but there's key Hebrew words to look at that are in this text, and the description of how we do some hermeneutics with this topic and comparing it to Genesis chapter 1 in the first 5 verses that I covered in part 1 on this topic. So please read the context for yourself, and don't just take my word for it, of course, but I'm expecting you to read the context for yourself, see if it matches up with everything that I express, and take the evidence as putting it to trial on different topics. What carries the most weight? What is the most explicit evidence to prove the conclusion that we should come to on this topic? And so putting the scriptures to the test and testing the spirits and seeing if they back up what is being spoken from the actual words here in the context. So I'm going to cover, like I said, key Hebrew words. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet, so to speak, without too much detail, but also covering the most important, most explicit aspects, points, questions, and conclusions to come to on this topic. So again, if I expose anything different than what you see in there, feel free to comment, or if you want to add to what I'm saying, or if it has a point of correction that I haven't covered or addressed well enough. Again, I allow comments, respectful comments on my video teachings, so feel free to do so. So jumping into this chapter of Nehemiah 13, starting in verses 15 here, as it is written, it says, "In those days I saw people in Yehuda," that's Judah, "treading wine presses on the Sabbath." Now the word the hey is not in that part there. It's just be Shabbat. So basically on Shabbat. A lot of translations will put the there. It's not, it's kind of added by the translator. But later on the is in there. That we'll see the hey at the end of this verse as we continue. "And bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens." You know, of course, during the 6 days a week, it's not burden, but these are type of burdens that shouldn't be done on Shabbat. It says, "which they brought into Yerushalayim." That's Jerusalem, as most translations say in English. It says, "on the Sabbath." I color-coded this, so what you see in blue, that's the be. That's the bet yom. That's the yud vav mem. That's the Hebrew homonym. Day can mean, as I pointed out in part 1 of this topic, it is a homonym. Beyom, here we see in the context, getting back to the verse here, it says, Ha-Shabbat, the Shabbat day, the Sabbath day. Interesting. Now, not a whole lot of evidence so far, so let's continue on. Verse 16 doesn't have a whole lot, so I'm going to bypass that and go to verse 17 here, where it says, Then I contended with the nobles of Yehuda and said to them, What evil thing this is that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day. Now notice that below this quote, I have in blue letters the olive and the tav. That's a word that's in there, two-letter word. It's not translated. You'll find it many times throughout the Tanakh, throughout what we call the Old Testament, not translated. And what modern rabbis will say is that this points to an object in a certain way, but it's more than just saying hey or the. With the letter hey you see in green, that's the Sabbath day, ha-Shabbat. But we see this olive and tav. We're going to see it two other times connected to Sabbath in this context, which is very interesting. Some people like to midrash on the olive and the tav because Yehoshua, HaMashiach, in the Brit Hadashah writings, or we say the New Testament, he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. In the book of Revelation, now Alpha and Omega is just simply the first Greek letter of the Greek alphabet, and Omega is the last Greek letter. But in Hebrew, it would be the olive and the tav. If we were to say in English, it would be the A and the Z. If you were to put just the first and the last letters together here. And so we see this word that's not translated into English or any other languages that I'm aware of, but it's in there. It's in the scriptures. In fact, Genesis 1 has only 7 words in it, 7 Hebrew words, and the middle word, right in the middle, with 3 words on each side, we have the olive and the tav. Now, I don't want to midrash too much on this with this topic here, because it would be a huge divergent. I don't want to be dogmatic on more ambiguous topics, but sticking to the explicit evidence here on the topic at hand, well, let's continue to verse 18 here. It says, Did not your fathers do thus? And did not our Yah bring all this disaster on us and on this city? What city? Jerusalem. Remember, the first temple was destroyed, right? So, yet, continuing in the quote here, yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So here, 2 verses in a row, we have the olive and the tav. Again, there's no blue letters I have quoted in there because that is not translated. But we see in green, that's the hey, referring to the, and then Shabbat, ha-Shabbat. Profaning ha-Shabbat. So now let's look at this verse 18 and verse 19. Let's put them together here. I've shown you independently with my insert here on the video, but put them together and let's look at this. Notice, not just idolatry that caused Israel's previous disasters, slavery or captivity, the destruction of the first temple, but according to Nehemiah, profaning his Sabbaths. Not our Sabbaths, not Jewish Sabbaths, but of course, when you read Leviticus 23, our Creator says these are his. The only time he points to the Israeli people and say they're yours is when they're adding and changing. We see in Isaiah chapter 1 and in Amos chapter, I think it's 5, where it's spoken of, I despise your Sabbath. So, of course, they were changing and blending in idolatry and profaning the Sabbaths. And here he is saying here that the Sabbaths are important, that they were a major cause in, not the only cause, I'm not saying they're the only one, but they are a big part of the cause of their disasters of the past. But of course, modern Christianity still thinks it's no big deal. 9 of those 10 commandments are important, but one of them is no big deal to him anymore. And wow, that's a dangerous statement to make, to say that it's no big deal to him anymore, because in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, doesn't he say, I do not change? And even in the book of Hebrews 13:8, it says that Yeshua HaMashiach is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So, wow, to say that these profaning the Sabbath, Nehemiah is trying to warn them not to repeat what has caused these disasters in the past. A big part of it, I think we can say. In fact, there's prophecies in the future, or at least at the end of the age, of the worst time in human history. There's 5 places in we say the Old and New Testament, the Holy Bible. We have Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 6 and 7. You can check that out for yourself. The time of Jacob's trouble, worst time. Ezekiel chapter 5 and verse 9, he talks about he's going to do unto them that he has never done before. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, again, a worst time in human history, prophesied there. And then we have 2 more times in the New Testament. We have in Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 21, we see a worst time in human history, right after he says, pray that your flight be not on a Sabbath day. Wow, it was no longer a big deal to him anymore. Why would he say on the Olivet prophecy, answering the question of verse 3, when will be the end of the age and the sign of his coming back, he says, pray that your flight be not on a Sabbath. Now, Christians often say that that's around the destruction of the temple. Well, even the destruction of the temple is set about 40 years after the death and resurrection. It wasn't all done at the cross. Here, often Christians say there's no commandment in the New Testament to keep the Sabbath, so I don't think it's important to him anymore. Well, Matthew 24:20, he does command that we pray that it not be on the Sabbath. And if it's not a command, somebody says, oh, that's not a commandment. Well, are we going to take his words that lightly and not take his warnings and his words seriously and to heart? Standing on dangerous ground, especially with these end times. If our Creator is going to chasten Israel, ancient Israel, so heavily with holocausts and disasters and destruction of the first temple and even the second one, and profaning the Sabbath, can be making them way too strict and burdensome, as well as too liberal. We don't want to be too liberal or too overly strict and cause people to throw the baby out with the bathwater and give up on the Sabbath because it's too difficult and too strict. So when I'm talking about obedience and not profaning the Shabbat, I'm talking about according to the written word, not Jewish oral law, or we say halakha, or even Christian interpretation and commandments and doctrines of men, whether it be Christianity or Judaism. What I'm talking about is when we see how to keep the Sabbath day holy, well, you can't understand the New Testament as well without the Old, and you can't understand the Tanakh as well without the New, and it goes both ways. One without the other is going to leave us incomplete in understanding this topic accurately. But sticking to this book of Nehemiah, notice here, again, we see the olive and the tav in both of these verses connecting to the Sabbath. 3 times we'll see, like I said, in the context, and the third one will be even perhaps the most interesting. So, but I'll get to that later. Let's go to the next verse here in verse 19. We see in verse 19 it says, so it was at the gates of Jerusalem as it began to be dark. Now notice, if you look at the Strong's Concordance, it'll give you the same Hebrew word, number 6751. That doesn't mean that it's listed twice in the text itself, but simply this word does not have a single word definition to it. And so when you are to define this word or translate this word, it can mean like twilight or beginning to be dark, or as it says here in the King James Version, the New King James, began to be dark, not at darkness, but this transition time period. And so it says, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath. That word before, as we can see there, Strong's number 6440, lepeni, however you want to pronounce the vowels there. The pei and the noon and the yud that's the root word there, the root letters for that word, meaning before. It's not talking about after the Sabbath. It can't be, it's not a homonym word there, as far as I understand it. But we see ha-Shabbat. Again, we got the hay before the Shabbat. Continuing in the verse, that I commanded the gates to be shut, and charged that they must not open until after. That Hebrew word, achar, or however you want to pronounce that, the Strong's number 310, after ha-Shabbat. Now that's important to consider the facts here, that it began to be dark. And of course, those who believe that the Sabbath begins with sunrise, they would look at this verse and say, oh, well, that doesn't mean that the Sabbath starts with darkness. It's just saying before the Sabbath, which of course they would say is the next day. And so Nehemiah is just telling them to shut the gates, and as it will continue here, but there's more evidence. Let's continue in verse 19 here. It says, then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Again, that's beh. We have the bet right before yom, that Hebrew word for day. And I highlighted that in blue. We could say on the Sabbath day, or we could say in the Sabbath, or within, or during. These are synonyms, of course, and ways to pronounce it. I think we can all agree that the bet pretty much means within or during the Sabbath day. So sunrise believers might say to that something like, well, yeah, he didn't want them doing anything during the night because they just wanted everyone out. So when the sun comes up, nobody will be lingering or getting out the gates late, and they don't want to deal with the stress when people are trying to sleep. So of course they want to just kind of deal with this before it gets dark. They didn't have electricity and lights and all the modern conveniences that we do, so they just wanted to deal with this before it got dark and everyone went to bed. Well, that is a logical way to look at it, but there's more evidence in the context here. So again, let's put it to the test. Let's put things to the trial, and people are going to have different ways to interpret this with logic. So notice, though, in verse 19, I'm going to connect verse 15 here, because this is important. If you connect verse 15 at the end of it, where it says, all kinds of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on, or in, or within the Sabbath day, Beyom HaShabbat. So I think it's real important to see, we see similar words here, burdens, brought in. And so also, since we see this word darkness in verse 15, I think it's also important to realize that darkness and night, as we see in Genesis 1:5, are different Hebrew words. So you can't just say the darkness that we see in verse 15 is referring to the same darkness, because as it says in Genesis 1:5, and Yah called the light day, and the darkness, the choshek, he called night. We have Lila. So Lila is the word for night, and darkness is choshek, as we see in Genesis 1:5. And so these three words, darkness, they're different Hebrew words. Notice the three different Hebrew words, which Nehemiah, verse 9, I say 13, verse 19, it doesn't have. So let's go to, you see, as I pointed out, there's Strong's number 2822 for Hoshek, and 3915, usually pronounced Lila. And then there's Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 19. The word dark is Zulalu, however you pronounce that. And so in Strong's, we have it number 6751. So let's stop right here and ask three important questions. Three important questions on what we just read here. If each 24-hour Sabbath must include night and darkness as being after the daylight portion of the Sabbath, that the darkness comes afterwards, not before, then why did Nehemiah not allow them to come in and get out during the night, darkness, before the Sabbath daylight? Why is he so strict about shutting the gates before it gets dark? No Friday night partying or selling things, which, Friday nights and even Saturday nights are big party nights even in our modern cultures. But why does he not allow it? That's a very important question to ask. And the second question asked is, why not command them to stop these Gentiles from coming into Jerusalem during the darkness after the Sabbath daylight? There's nothing in the context about saying, now make sure that they don't come in after the Sabbath day during the darkness portion. There's nothing even hinting toward that in the context. If I'm wrong, again, please point it out to me. Because if the Sabbaths are to include night and darkness after each Sabbath day, why is that not guarded as well? There's no evidence, no description of it. Or, the third question we should ask is are all Sabbaths only during the daylight? Only. Never during any darkness. So all darkness is never Shabbat each week. That would only be that seventh daylight portion from sunrise to sunset. And some people probably come to that conclusion, that it's only about half of 24 hours, depending on how long the daylight portion is during the year, wherever you live on earth. And so why, and so if you conclude that it is not a complete 24 hours, that a Sabbath, that a Shabbat is not a complete 24 hours, give or take, if you want to put a little fence around each end and make sure you enter the Sabbath and come out of it, not cutting it at exactly 24. And in Judaism, they call it a 25-hour Sabbath, just to kind of make sure there's some transition time. And that's just how days are. When the sun goes down, it transitions slowly. And that has been debated in Judaism. On when does the Sabbath begin? Is there 3 stars in the sky? When it goes down on the mountain, or the horizontal sunset? And there's a lot of debate you could see within the sages on that. And often a conclusion is, well, okay, if it's not a cloudy night, then 3 stars would determine that it's dark enough to determine a Shabbat. Now that's, of course, man's interpretation, but it's somewhere in that dusk, that twilight, before it's dark, as it's beginning to get dark, as it says here in the book of Nehemiah. So let's, after answering those 3 questions, and I ask them and propose them to you, and I have my conclusions and answers to those questions, and I think these scriptures answer that well enough and by themselves. But let's continue here, because there's more valuable information putting these scriptures to the test. Verse 21, it says, "Then I warned them," this is Nehemiah speaking again, "then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall?" Again, look at the context. This is still what we call in modern times Friday night. And this after the 6th day, the sun sets, and then we have that night. This is when he's speaking, because remember he says before the Sabbath day, right? So getting back to the verse 15 and forward here, look at the context. It's still Friday night when we get to verse 21. If you do so again, he says, I will lay hands on you. Now, I don't think he's talking about massage therapy and giving them a nice comfortable massage. When he says I'm laying hands on you, I don't think Nehemiah was a weak person. He was probably like a Judah Maccabee, and he's contending with them here very strongly. And continuing in verse 21, he says, from that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And there's the Hebrew for you below that quote. We have the lo, that's no. And then we have the bet also before the Shabbat, the Bes Shabbat. But there's no hey in there, so I didn't highlight the in the quoting from the New King James Version here. So I left that white, as you can see right above it. They came no more on Shabbat. And why? So let's notice here, no hey in there. Why is that? Well, I don't want to make too much of it, but if it did say ha-Shabbat, or if it had the word, notice how there's no word for day. Yom isn't in there. And so we can look at this, and yeah, if it said Yom, there's that Hebrew homonym, which could make it a little bit more ambiguous. But when we see on Shabbat, or we say during or in within Shabbat, this would cover the darkness portion of the Shabbat. Makes it a little bit more explicit, not perfectly, but leaving out the Yom and the Hey, I think offers some interesting things to meditate and ponder upon. Nevertheless, let's go to verse 22. Wow, this is a great verse. Interesting how this verse turns out when we read it. It says here, and I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Now, I highlighted guard the gates. That's not the olive and the tav. I don't mean to make that connection, but I did highlight that in blue and the olive and tav in blue because it's interesting. Who is guarding the gates? Well, of course, the Levites, he's telling them, but pointing to, well, remember Yeshua says, he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one, ultimately, the Mashiach is going to guard the Sabbath. He's not going to change it. He's going to teach it more accurately on how to observe it and to keep it in balance without being too strict, without being too loosey-goosey or greasy or liberal with it. And so we can see that the Sabbath was made for man, of course, but guarding the gates, I've got here in red, sanctify, we have the lekodesh. Kodesh is the Hebrew word for sanctify, holy, make holy, set apart. Kodesh, ha-Shabbat. We have the ha-Shabbat there, Yom ha-Shabbat. Again, the olive and the tav is not translated, but it's interesting to see that it is in there. And olive tav is elsewhere in this chapter, but connected to Sabbath, I've only found 3 as I went through and read it from the Hebrew Tanakh that I have, the Stone Edition. But after viewing verse 22, isn't that interesting? There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but this is an important verse because there's 3 obvious facts that we should see from this verse. Very important, obvious facts. Notice when they were guarding the gates, again from Friday before it got dark until the end of the Shabbat daylight, or day, Yom, can also mean just daylight portion. It can also mean 24 hours. It's a homonym word, but by putting all the evidence together, when Nehemiah was speaking this, he said before the Sabbath, and before the Sabbath day when it was beginning to get dark. Not when it was dark, but before, when it was beginning to. And then point number 2 factors, there's no evidence, again, in the context, that the gates were shut after the Sabbath daylight portion. As we say in modern terminology, Saturday night to Sunday morning, or Saturday sunset to Sunday sunrise. We don't see anything about guarding the gates during that darkness within this verse. And when we consider all these 7 verses here, in Nehemiah chapter 13, it says it begins with Friday evening according to verse 19. As quoting at the end, it says, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath. So 3 important facts. Now, if anyone wants to play clever intellectual word games or interpretations or have diversion of tactics away from the topic of these 3 facts in here, and to distort and or to avoid these blockbuster questions that I've asked, those 3 questions and also the 3 facts, then if it's tricking anybody that you know, well, tell them that, please tell them that I have a really nice Golden Gate Bridge for sale. Yes, and I also have a oceanfront property in Arizona. And not just to the highest bidder, but how about to all bidders? Just send me your money. And, I can make it a timeshare if you want to believe that. I hope you can sense my little humor, sarcasm here. But if that's not property good enough for you, then how about this more realistic one here? You can see that it's lower priced here if you even want it. But, again, as George Strait would sing, he says, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona. From my front porch you can see the sea. And if you buy that, I'll throw the Golden Gate in free. Well, finishing off here in conclusion with a little humor. Hope you don't take that too seriously. But seriously, this topic is so explicit on when the Sabbath begins. And so it'll help propelling forward as we go into Yom Kippur, the evening to evening, and there's homonyms, more different ways to interpret it. But we need to have all the scriptures agree. If it's all been inspired by him, that's great. So in the meantime, until part 3 comes out sometime in 2018, of course, surely not near any theaters near you, but here on YouTube in cyberspace.